Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. I actually don't even know what number. I don't have the YouTube up, and I lost number 34, I guess. So it's been we've been doing quite a bunch of these, and almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern, we've been talking with a left-wing thinker, one particular topic. They've been lecturing for around 30 minutes, and then we've been doing a Q&A with our audience, you. So if you want to participate in that Q&A, all you have to do is make sure you're logged into YouTube. Then you can put questions in the chat during the talk. We have a really good lineup this week. We have contributions like tomorrow on the nature of Marxism, why it's not Eurocentric, even though that's a common refrain from liberals and even some self-described radicals. And then we have another contribution on Wednesday about what a foreign policy for the left would look like, the left in power, if a social democratic or populist administration would come to power, much less a more radical socialist government. What would be the practical nature of our foreign policy as opposed to just broad, sweeping, though obviously correct and inspirational rhetoric about internationalism? What would we do in practice? Then later in the week, we have Leah Ippy on John Rawls and his theory of justice's relationship to socialism. So that should be a very interesting talk as well. Then obviously every Saturday, we have weekends with Anna Kasparian, Michael Brooks. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by René Rojas, who's been a long time collaborator with Jacobin as a project. He's also on the editorial board of Catalyst, Journal of Theory of Strategy, which is published by Jacobin. And his Catalyst essay, The Latin American Left's Shifting Tides, is really one of the best things that the journal has produced. We've only put out like 12 issues or so, but out of that 12, this might be the very best piece we put out. René is also an assistant professor at SUNY Binghamton, upstate, and that's where he's joining us from now. But before I pass it off to René, just a reminder to everyone watching, please press like and press subscribe, whether you're watching live or you're watching many months in the future. By pressing like and pressing subscribe, you allow us to reach more people. The YouTube algorithm is how we're reaching most of our people, because we're not actually putting a lot into promoting these talks otherwise, and it's been great. We've been kind of growing our audience, but we get there by you just pressing like and subscribe. And we're obviously not charging for this. We don't have a Patreon. We don't have anything set up related to this series in particular. That's our only ask. Just press like, press subscribe. And if you are interested in Jacobin's work, then you could still actually subscribe to Jacobin until midnight for $1 for the entire year. So if you're watching this live, we have a Mayday link, which is almost gone from the internet because I was supposed to turn off the sale at noon, but I will put it in the chat in just 1 minute and I'll add it to the description. So please do that as well. And René, I'll pass it off to you. And after René is done, obviously we're going to have that Q&A. So if anyone else has questions for him, please do put it in the chat. But go ahead, comrade.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk about some of my work. In particular, I want to discuss what's known as the pink tide, both the rise, the fall, the promise of the pink tide, and also the reasons for its collapse. What is the pink tide in very broad terms? The pink tide refers to a series of reform governments, of leftist governments that came to power in some Latin American countries, by my understanding, 4 to be exact, beginning around the turn of the century. Now, why should we even think about the pink tide today, particularly given that most of these reform governments have since fallen? Well, the pink tide, I think, for the global left, right, represented a wave of movements and reform governments, right, in power that was considered very, very promising, not just for the region, not just for working people, working masses in Latin America, but really for the entire world and for the international left in particular. So it's, incumbent on us to examine what the pink tide was, how it was able to rise to power, and why it fell. So part of, I guess, a big part of this talk will be devoted to discussing its reversals and really that amount to the collapse of the pink tide. Let me just start by kind of defining in a little more detail what this pink tide was. What was this wave of mass movements and reform governments that reached power in the Latin American countries that I wrote about in the essay? I think the pink tide was characterized by two key features. On the one hand, these countries, right, experienced, beginning about the mid-90s, right, rising and escalating waves of protests. There were just cycles of protests that grew and grew, right, in breadth and in intensity over the years, right, until they were powerful enough to topple existing governments, right? That's the first feature. The second feature of the pink tide of these countries was something that was happening simultaneously in a way that was intimately related to this rise of protest, was the disintegration of the ruling party systems in these countries. These countries were, had adopted neoliberal policies, had deregulated and opened up their economies, right? And in so doing, ruling parties began to sever their links with their traditional constituencies, mostly labor and other popular sectors, right? So this, on the one hand, of course, kind of freed these popular sectors to organize independently and to mount these cycles of protest. But simultaneously, what it did is eroded the very institutional foundations of governing systems, right? They lost legitimacy. They lost kind of their appeals to being representative, and eventually these party systems collapsed, right? So those are the two defining features of the pink tide. Again, on the one hand, escalating cycles of protest, just mass movements that grew over the years. And on the other hand, the collapse of ruling party systems. Now, really, I think there are four countries that fit into this category during that period. And these are countries I think most folks on the left have heard about: Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, and Ecuador. It's only in those four countries, right, that these two features were prominent. So at least by my definition, the pink tide doesn't include all leftist reform governments in the region at the time. For instance, I would not include Brazil under the PT. I wouldn't include, for instance, Chile, the country, my country of origin, where the socialist government, in coalition with the center, has ruled since the year 2000. It certainly wouldn't include a country like Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas returned to power. Mainly, let's focus on Brazil and Chile. I would not include these cases because they did not experience the combination of these two key features. I might want to say something about that later on in the Q&A. Right, so let's focus on the pink tide as I've defined these four cases. First question I think we should ask is really, what explains not only its rise, which I've touched on, but its fall, its collapse, right? If you look across these countries, right, in Argentina, the center-left reform party in power lost elections in 2015. In Ecuador, the kind of center-left, though it won the last elections, it became fractured, and the right wing of the party took over and reversed not all, but many of the social reforms and the gains that were made previously under Correa. We pretty much all know the situation in Venezuela, right, where there's been an absolute collapse of the economy and a total erosion of the legitimacy of the Chavistas in power, in Maduro in particular today. And then I think we're all familiar with recent events in Bolivia, where something akin to a coup ousted Morales from power in the fall of last year, right? So how do we explain these reversals and these defeats? Well, let me quickly just touch on some common kind of explanations. And what's interesting about some of the explanations are that both those that come from the right, along with those that are coming from the left, they share something in particular, which I'll get at in a bit. But from the right, the critique was that these were just irresponsible, fiscally irresponsible, right? Populists who were just interested in remaining in power, right? And so they polarized society, they weakened civil society, and led to fiscal disaster, right? On the left, I think many radicals, they don't necessarily critique the pink tide for being too populist, or for what might be called demagogic overreach, right? Instead, they point to their acquiescence to business elites, right? We're told by many folks on the left that these were really mild reformers who were too weak, or at least never had the intention really of pushing for further reform. Right now, what's interesting about both of these critiques is that they share something, right? There's a commonality. Both adopt what I've called a voluntarist approach to assessing, right, the region's left turn, both its rise and its fall, right? They focus on decisions made by those in power, right, those in charge of the reform process, but they ignore, at least they don't give much attention to the broader context, right? The real constraints that these governments face. And so in both cases, critiques share a certain voluntarism, focusing on the will of governing reformers more than anything else, right? I want to go beyond that. I want to explain particularly the fall of the pink tide by pointing to constraints that these reform governments faced. Before doing so, however, I think it's useful to kind of sharpen the question of the pink tide's reversals and collapse, right? The fact of the matter is that when these governments came to power, right, these pink tide governments came to power, they actually they pushed through reforms that were very beneficial to working people and popular masses. I mean, they certainly increased fairly dramatically social spending, right? So in that sense, they mitigated the harshest effects of liberalization, neoliberalism on working people. And they managed to reduce poverty, some quite dramatically, and inequality in these countries as well. Beyond that, they also reincorporated the poor masses kind of into politics, into governing, into the institutions of governing parties, and into the state. So that just kind of raises this puzzle, right? The puzzle, as I see it, right, is if they were able to do this, if they were able to improve, right, social indices and the social conditions of working people, they're able to gain the support and incorporate masses into their parties and into the state, right? What happened? Why did that hit a wall? Fact of the matter is that the revenues, or the public revenues that these governments were channeling into social provision, right, were intimately tied to commodity rents, right, to the exports of natural commodities. So as global prices expanded for these commodities, so did social spending. But when these prices stagnated or fell, social spending also stagnated and even contracted. So then we got to ask ourselves, why, right? Why did the pink tide fail to break out of this confinement? Why did it continue to depend on, commodity rents, rather than to push their economies into a more diversified and more sustainable growth models, right, that could actually address, right, the pressing need for ongoing reform and for deeper democratization and incorporation of the masses. The question is all the more puzzling because, these governments, I think they were very aware that expanded social spending, expanding social provision was their ticket to remaining in power. So the question then becomes, why were they incapable, right, of transforming their growth models, even as, their failure to do so meant that they lost popular backing, they lost a series of elections, and eventually became extremely weak and vulnerable to being toppled by the right. Right. When I posed this question, when I set out to answer it in the essay that Bhaskar mentioned, right, I thought a useful way of getting at this was to compare the pink tide left to an earlier generation of left movements and parties in Latin America. Right, earlier generation that many call the classical left in the region. Right, so I felt that if we could, if we compared what happened to the pink tide to this classical left, the left of the 60s and the 70s, we could get more explanatory leverage on the limitations to the left. But the key would be, right, to focus not on the individual decisions or the individual shortcomings or the lack of will among the governing elites to change, but to focus on their actual ability to change, right? So by contrasting the pink tide to the classical left, we could look at the constraints that both faced, right, that were imposed by the context in which they governed and operated, right? So this allows us, I think, to identify real weaknesses, not of character, not of will, right, but weaknesses that perhaps were built into the pink tide left itself, and that the left presently and in the future, right, it has to address and overcome if we want to rebuild, renew our battles and our efforts at making change and taking power when it says so. Okay, now, so besides this, setting up the comparison this way, I felt that I should not only, do a superficial kind of historical comparison, but what's needed was to compare the actual capacities. I mentioned earlier that, what I tried to do was to focus on abilities to make change, abilities to push for deeper transformations. So I felt that it was absolutely necessary to focus on the capacities of both of these lefts, the classical left and the more recent pink tide left. And I think there are two dimensions when it comes to these types of capacities for change that I'm talking about. On the one hand, and this isn't something I've come up with, obviously, this is something that other sociologists, in particular Eric Wright, has developed in his work, right? But there are two kind of dimensions of capacity or power for the left and for working and popular masses. On the one hand, there's associational capacity, right? This really refers to the ability, the capacity to coordinate and to mobilize, right, participants, constituents, and members. And these capacities are formed by the resources that underpin organizational bonds, cultures, infrastructure, right? So these are generally what are called organizational resources. These are resources that help working people overcome divisions and the costs that normally inhibit, right, their protest. Now, without robust and vigorous, right, resources to form this associational capacity and fabric, right, not only have a very hard time developing the solidarity, the preparation, and the coordination needed for collective actions. That's associational capacity. Another dimension of non-elite, if you will, working people, popular sectors, capacities or powers, is structural power, right? Now, in contrast to associational capacity, structural power comes from leverage that ordinary people enjoy owing to their location and their contributions to institutions valued by elites. So unlike mobilizational capacities that have to be built up, right? You have to amass organizational resources to build associational and mobilizational capacities. Right? Unlike that, structural leverage is typically built into non-elite sectors' positions in the economy, right? It's rooted in the reliance of ruling elites and ruling classes on working people's labor for achieving their ends. And as the source, and the reliance on them as a source for their own wealth and income. This gives working people enormous leverage, right? Because if they withhold their contribution, in this case their work, or threaten to do so, they can impose damaging costs onto elites. And this becomes a lever, a very powerful lever for extracting concessions from business elites and centers of power. So that's I think the framework, both a comparative and a conceptual framework, to better understand, right, the collapse of the pink tide. Let me go ahead and summarize the argument I make about why the pink tide failed. Recall that I said that the pink tide, right, eventually, right, lost its support among popular masses. And they either lost elections, right, or they were weakened to the point where they became susceptible to being toppled by kind of newly invigorated right. My argument is that the pink tide, these reform governments failed to move forward, right, failed to push to into kind of more substantial restructuring of their economies and their societies, not out of some kind of overriding obligations to business and elites. Rather, the way I see it, they failed to deepen reforms, the very reforms that might have secured the backing they needed to stay in power, because essentially they were ill-equipped to take that more challenging route, right? And I actually think they were correct in that assessment. They just didn't have the capacity to do so. So they were incapable of pressing in that direction. And so they had to opt for the more achievable short-term gains, avoiding, right, what would have been a losing head-on collision with local ruling classes, right? So what do they do instead? They opt to win elections, relying on the resources available to them through these commodity rents, right? But leave the underlying economic status quo untouched, right? If we compare this to the classical left, right, we see how different, right, the situation was in the previous era. The classical left faced a different set of strategic dilemmas, right? They faced very hostile political elites, right? I'm talking about parties and authorities in power. Yet from below, right, they fought to compel these governments to adopt more fundamental reforms. They didn't have the advantage necessarily of being in power, yet left parties, left movements, right, pushed, trying to compel them to adopt more radical reforms. Why this contrast, right? What explains this contrast? Well, the way to understand it, I think, is to place each of these generations of the left in their historical context. The classical left, right, has to be understood in the context of what's called, and I'll get into this in a bit, post-war developmentalism, right? Developmentalist policies that elites adopted, right? This context conferred upon them, gave them not only very high associational and mobilizational capacity, right? They are able to build organizations and coordinate, mobilize their movements, right, in a very forceful way. But these very capacities were founded on an enormous amount of structural power. That's why they could push elites to make these changes. The pink tide, right, in contrast, right, has been understood in a very different political economic context, the context of neoliberalism, of liberalization, of the state abandoning and business elites abandoning, right, the ability, or the effort, I should say, campaigns to reshape their economies. Now, what did this mean? That over decades of neoliberalism, right, the movements behind the pink tide, they did develop high associational and mobilizational capacities, right, and they used this to great effect. but they always suffered from low levels, right, of structural power. So they're able to build associational capacity despite the absence of structural power. So let's say more about, let's contrast these two experiences, right, and get into them. Why was the classical left, right, endowed with these capacities? Well, the reason was that elites themselves, right, promoted a project of economic change, of restructuring, modernization, really industrialization, right, that developed these capacities for the left. And when they used these capacities, when they mobilized them, elites actually opted to turn around and crush these movements, crush these left parties, because they felt that popular constituencies were pushing too far. Pink Tide, by contrast, right, developed capacities, as I mentioned earlier, in a different context, right? It's in a context in which elites have abandoned, their developmentalist ambitions, right? Abandoned industrial restructuring and development, right? And leaving popular masses, right, to confront the cost of neoliberalism on their own. Now, this leads to a reorganization of popular capacities, right? That, as I mentioned earlier, pushes workers, marginalized groups, the poor, to mobilize, right? But in lacking underlying structural leverage, right, they can't push pink tide governments, pink tide parties in power to go further, to push for deeper reform, right? And so they eventually give up on pink tide governments. They eventually withdraw their support. They eventually abandon them, stop voting for them, and weaken. Let me just say more about why the kind of classical left is able to develop these capacities in the context in which they operated, right? Excuse me. The classical left emerges, right, in a context in which elites themselves, business elites, right, move to, as I said earlier, to modernize their economies, right, to push through a comprehensive, right, industrialization, modernization of their economies through manufacturing, right, and that has some very, very, very deep consequences, right? As elites move, right, from a more agricultural commodity-based economy and start pumping resources and investing into this industrialization project, right, it actually fosters the creation of a new working class, right? As the state gets involved, right, at the behest of business, in transferring investments into industry, building these new manufacturing centers that are in fact highly coordinated, very integrated, right? What it does is it starts placing working people, right, in the most strategic nodes of the economy. What's happening is that hundreds of thousands of workers, right, are moving to the city and being positioned in manufacturing in the very, very industries that elites value the most, right? So suddenly they find themselves in the most strategic positions with, for elites, inordinate levels of leverage, right? And they realize this, and they use this leverage, right, to, on the one hand, get organized, right? They start building their associational capacities. They start building unions. They start strengthening labor parties, right? And once they've built up their organizations, they turn around and leverage it. They actually either threaten to go on strike or go on strike in increasing numbers. If you look at the statistics throughout Latin America at the time, right, particularly where industrialization had advanced the most, right, you see that not only was the share of the working population that's now working in manufacturing, right, doubling in most of these societies, right, the level of organization is also skyrocketing, right? Union density starts to grow enormously. In some countries like Chile, up to a third of the population becomes unionized. In Argentina, right, by the mid 70s, half of all working people had been organized into unions at the time. So now the working class in Latin America, right, is endowed with, on the one hand, right, this very strategic positioning in the economy, and on the other hand, with high levels of organization, right? Unions in particular that allow them to coordinate and mobilize. And in so doing, right, they give workers a platform on which to make serious demands, either again by going on strike or by threatening to strike. And this is how the classical left, on the one hand, builds its parties, builds its organization. And on the other hand, again, from below and from outside centers of power, pushes elites to make concessions, right? Now, there were some very important achievements that were gained by the classical left at the time, right? Their growing power, both in structural terms, but also in associational terms, push the states, right, to democratize the politics in these countries, moving away from the oligarchic forms of rule that had characterized the region in the first half of the 20th century, right? That's one big achievement. Another achievement is that it managed to create much more egalitarian societies, right? Inequality, while it was still, these remained very unequal societies, right? Inequality was reduced significantly. And lastly, I want to point to another huge achievement by the classical left, something that I think not only doesn't get sufficient attention, doesn't get the attention it deserves. Often, I think in retrospect, we tend to criticize the left for not promoting these achievements. And I'm referring here to the classical left's ability to undermine other forms of oppression, not just economic and material oppression, but the oppression of women, the oppression of indigenous groups, et cetera, right? So the left, as it's democratizing society, as it's creating a more egalitarian countries, right? It's also able to reduce and combat these other forms of oppression, right? Now, in fact, the classical left was so successful, right, that it triggered a backlash by elites, right? Elites realized what was happening. Elites saw that their very project for economic development, the very industrialization campaign, right, was creating this very powerful class that not only could seek reforms, but could actually use its position to challenge the basis of bourgeois power. And what you see in response across the region, right, is a series of military interventions, a series of coups beginning in the 60s, really speeding up in the 70s, right, aiming at totally destroying this power, right, of crushing the working class's growing power. Now, they didn't all succeed the way they wanted to. The case in which elites succeeded most effectively at crushing working class power was in Chile, where there was ruthless elimination, both of the actual organizations, actual workers themselves, physical elimination, but also, right, the elimination of the foundations, the structural foundations for this power as the military government restructured its political economy. In other countries, the elite efforts at destroying working class power weren't as successful, and they were much more drawn out. And I think Argentina and Brazil are good examples of this. I won't go into more detail, but that's the classical left, right? Now, I'd like to turn to the pink tide left. I know I've spoken for too long about this, right? How do we understand, similarly, the way we place the classical left in its context? How can we place the pink tide left in its context to best understand, right, both its achievements and its limitations? As I hinted at earlier, I think the way to do this, right, the best way to understand both the rise and the collapse of the pink tide left is to place it in the context of neoliberalism, right? Then this new left in Latin America, right, which emerges after 2 decades of defeat, right, after the classical left had been battered and crushed, right, emerges in a very starkly different context, the context of economic liberalization. One of the basic one of the basic, I should say, projects, right, that elites adopted in response to the challenge by the classical left was a restructuring of national economies, right, to move away from industrialization, the type of developmentalism that the state used to, that business elites themselves used to support, right, abandon that and return to economies predicated on the so-called comparative advantages of their natural production, of their natural commodity production, right? And two things happened as elites moved toward neoliberalism, right? On the one hand, right, the working classes in these countries were completely restructured, were completely transformed, right, from a toiling class that was highly organized, that was positioned in these strategic, right, in nodal positions in the economy, right, to a working class that is completely fragmented, that is atomized, right, reflecting the very fragmentation of the neoliberal political economic order, right? That's the one thing that happens, right? So as a result, the working classes under neoliberalism, right, lose their structural leverage, right? But they also see their associational capacities completely eroded, weakened, and because of this fragmentation. That's the first major consequence of the move toward open markets, the abandonment of the state's campaign to industrialize, to modernize these economies. Along with that, and this is the second consequence, what you see in these societies, right, is the complete complete social devastation, right? As the economies are transformed, right? As manufacturing is kind of disintegrated, right? The working classes are kind of thrown out of these forms of work, these forms of production, thrown into the informal economy, right? On average, throughout the 80s and 90s, around 50 to 60% of Latin American workforces toiled in the informal sector, right? Not enjoying work or not having jobs in a real kind of formal work setting with any kind of protections, just left to fend for themselves in precarious forms of work. So you see, as a consequence, also this, the social devastation that accompanies that, right, and a new form of mass marginalization, right, mass kind of shifts, right, of the working population into the peripheries of the neoliberal economy, right? And that really sets the stage for the rise of the pink tide. How? Well, though it took a very long time, little by little, this restructured and marginalized working class in Latin America, right, begins first in kind of taking defensive stances and using defensive tactics, but it begins to rebuild its associational capacities. Essentially, it gets reorganized, right, to overcome this fragmentation, this atomization, but also to address the real social devastation that most working people were suffering, right? Gradually, these forms of defensive kind of organization, this defensive reconstruction of associational capacity goes on the offensive, right? And this happens at a point when the popular movements, their organizations had grown, right, formidable enough so they can start making demands on, as I mentioned earlier, an increasingly weakened ruling system. Political parties had lost their legitimacy, had lost their connections to organized constituencies, and had become very, these ruling party systems had become very fragile, right? So after rebuilding their associational capacities, these new mass movements go on the offensive. And you see this throughout the 4 countries I mentioned. In Argentina, for instance, over the course of the 90s, right, unemployed workers who had been tossed out to the street as the country industrialized, or as industry, was disintegrated, right? These national integrated industrial complexes, right, were kind of torn apart, leaving entire industrial towns, right, unemployed. And as these workers were tossed into the street, and as they, were forced to find a living in the informal market, right, they turned to more aggressive political tactics around the mid-90s. They start disrupting these towns by, for instance, cutting off major highways, by forming blockades, right? Demanding some relief, welfare relief, right? From there, there's an escalation. These movements are called piqueteros, right? Because form pickets on roads. These piquetero movements of unemployed or informally employed workers grow larger and larger. They essentially, right, descend onto the capital, cut off all communication with the rest of the country, choke the capital essentially, right, until they're able to use this disruptive ability that comes from their growing organization to topple governments. You see something very similar, for instance, in Bolivia. In Venezuela, it's a bit, the timing of it, the periodization is a bit different, but you see something quite similar. And as these new mass movements with their growing associational capacities, right, topple governments, they're able to vote in these new reform governments. Hugo Chavez is elected first in 1998 in Venezuela. Nestor Kirchner, 5 years later, is elected to power in Argentina, right, on the back of these types of mobilizations. In Bolivia, right, peasant and marginalized communities mobilize first in 2000, then 2003, then 2005, and what are called the water and the gas wars, right? Similarly, right, deploying their organization in an escalating manner and choking off centers of power, forcing their governments to fall. At that point, as I mentioned, they're able to elect reform governments to power, and that's how we get the pinta. But here's the thing: while they were able to elect reform governments to power, while they were able to not only obtain relief, but also force these governments to pump, as I said earlier, more revenues into social spending, right? As they're able to kind of demand a more robust safety. What they're not able to do, right, is push beyond that, demanding deeper structural change, deeper transformations of their economies. And again, to reiterate, and here's where the comparison with the classical left is best suits us. The reason they're unable to do so, right, is because now the working class has gone from an industrial working class, right, working in the commanding heights of the economy, right, to an informal working class, working in the margins, working in shanty towns, right? Barely scraping by. And so even when pink tide governments realize this dynamic, they realize that they need to offer their constituents more. That's actually, as I said earlier, that's what got them to power, right? There's not a strong enough social force behind them to push them to make those hard choices, to push them to confront business elites in a way that would actually, right, place radical structural reform on the agenda. Um, Essentially, without that structural backing, without that power, social power behind them, pink tide governments felt that it just was too daunting to take on this challenge, right? And so what did they do? Well, they kind of conformed themselves, right, to doing the best they could to continue spending on their constituents, but within the confines, within the constraints of the neoliberal political economy that they had inherited. Now, that was fine as long as revenues were still growing, as long as commodity prices on the global markets were still high. But once they plummeted, once they fell, right, the pink tide was in a corner it could not get out of. It rather than look for alternative routes, alternative models of development, right? It was stuck within this model and had to turn to austerity. And once that happened, they started to lose popular support. And that's why, in the end, you see the unraveling of pink tide governments. I'll leave it at that. We can get into more questions about the specifics during the Q&A.
That was really great, Renee. So once again, René Rojas is a assistant professor at SUNY Binghamton, and he's also on the editorial board of Catalyst. I highly recommend that you check out his long essay on the pink tide, which came out almost 2 years ago now, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in Catalyst. It's not paywalled. We should have a link in the description. Renee is also working on a follow-up with recent updates and talking about some of the countries he wasn't able to really get into in his last piece. That should be out in the summer edition of Catalyst, which will be out in maybe 4 months or so, 3.5, 4 months. That's a real deadline, at least. I'm not sure if Vivek is maybe giving you fake deadlines to try to get everyone on schedule. So
Bhaskar, I heard you say 4 months, so I have 4
4
months.
months, yeah. Yeah, right. That's going to get me in trouble. So anyway, if you want to participate in this discussion, please do. You throw a couple questions in. We can't go too late, so we're only going to have time for a couple questions. In the meantime, just one last reminder: please press like, press subscribe. It's how we reach more people with these videos. So I want to actually get to a question that's um, about the nature of populism, the type of populism that the pink tide employed, and pink tide leaders employ that rhetoric. So obviously, your piece and your lecture here tonight, you laid out the material backdrop to why, for instance, a Chavista rhetoric varied from the classical left wing rhetoric, and why it spoke to kind of the masses of people that were employed in the informal economy and whatever else. So obviously, this rhetoric of populism has become quite popular in European left circles and North American left circles in recent years with the Podemos phenomenon and whatnot. But there's a distinctive Latin American populist tradition that predates that. So I'm wondering, one, for these movements like Podemos that are in a vastly different context, that are in countries that are still, fairly, industrialized economies that still have a pretty coherent formal economy, even though people often talk about the rise of precarious work in these economies and so on. Basically, how that rhetoric of populism differs in the rhetoric of populism in Latin America, what inspirations they seem to be drawing from pink tide populism, and I guess the deeper roots of populism in Latin America. I guess that's my question, kind of comparing these two populist phenomenons, and how we should think about how they're different, the rhetoric.
Um, yeah, populism in Latin America, well, let's say pink tide populism, as you said, right, has roots in the political history of the region that go back very far. Populism in the region, right, was a consequence, right, as a political project, was a consequence of what was really an oligarchic political system, right, well into the 20th century. And what you see as a result of that, right, you see early on the emergence of challengers to the oligarchic elites, right, a kind of layer of modernizing politicians and movements, right, that in order to break the hold of oligarchic elites on political power, understand that they have to mobilize, right, the impoverished masses, peasants, this nascent working classes in the cities, right? So I think that because of that, the tradition of populism in Latin America shares some commonalities with kind of current day populism, be it in Europe. You mentioned Podemos, maybe even in England and the U.S. you will, where you have this new left wing versus right wing populism. It shares some features within, right? But I think there's one difference. Of course, the features that or one of the key features that Latin American populism shares with contemporary populism is this kind of anti-elitism, right? This notion of the people broadly defined, right? But in a very vague and nebulous way pitted against elites, right? That's something that obviously Latin American populism, that's something that obviously characterized Latin American populism. But I think one of the differences that Latin American populism has, for all its appeals to, the broad people, right? It has a very strong class, content to it, substance to it, right? When populists in Latin America, for instance, are trying to mobilize against oligarchic elites, they understand very quickly that they need to actually counter-mobilize, right? I should say, an organized working class, an organized peasantry in the countryside, for instance. So these new populist caudillos that emerge in the region, right? They go beyond just a vague anti-elite, rhetoric and political program that appeals to the masses, writ large. They actually endorse and support, right, the organization of workers as workers, right? The organization of peasants as peasants, right? And what happens then is that populism, kind of this really is a second wave of populism in the post-war era, or right before the post-war era and into the post-war era in Latin America, right? Takes on this very sharp class character, right? And in many countries, this populism then kind of feeds into the more independent organization of the working class, independent militancy and organizing that you see by the working class and the peasantry in economies that were still rural. So, pink tide populism, right, I think harkens back to that in a sense. And in countries where you see it most pronounced, like in Venezuela, right, as a result, the class component to it is, at least in rhetoric, is very sharp as well, right?
Chavez was
in
charismatic.
Argentina, neo-populism under these neo-Peronists, the Kirchners, right, also relies heavily on, returning to, or trying to return to, the working class, what's left of a very shattered working class, as its basis, right? But as I went over during the lecture, the old working class, no longer exists in Latin America the way it had in the earlier period. And so what you see is these appeals to kind of, class social justice, right? Ultimately operating on the organizational basis of a more fragmented, atomized working class.
Right, and obviously these aren't attempts to construct a national popular vision that includes big um, portions of the national bourgeoisie and so on. These are attempts in the pink tide to create, essentially class projects that don't really try to incorporate parts of the so-called national bourgeoisie. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Of course, throughout, and in some countries more than others, right, there is an accommodation that emerges with national business elites, right? You see this definitely in Argentina. You see it in Bolivia, even in Venezuela, where there's this emergence of what's called the Boliburguesia, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, right? That's there, and that's a basic fact of the pink tide, that kind of collaboration, if you will, right? But in terms of a political project, in terms of the political organizing, right, and the parties themselves that the pink tide is trying to mobilize, right, its composition, right, is largely working class. It excludes, right, sectors of like progressive sectors, so-called progressive sectors of the national bourgeoisie. And ironically, right, the populism of the earlier period that in many ways kind of gave oxygen to the rise of new independent, the class forces that I was going over in the lecture. Ironically, right, that old populism was very corporatist in nature, and it did try to bring in, sectors of the national developmentalist bourgeoisie.
I guess we should note that neither of us believe in this concept that there was a enlightened segment of capitalists in third world countries that were had any other motivation other than survival in the market and therefore profit making.
Yeah, and this is something that characterized the classical left. I think I failed to kind of describe that aspect of it, right? So the classical left and these new working class forces are emerging, are becoming constituted, right, in this kind of developmentalist era under ISI, import substitution industrialization, right? That program as an elite program definitely, right, was a business program. It was a project of the new industrial elites, right? And so the state was, had formed an alliance with the bourgeoisies in these countries. But one of the things that characterizes the classical left is that it attempts to break free, right, from a subordinate position, and so an alliance, but in a subordinate position to modernizing elites, and it tries to, and it does organize real independent working class power.
Yeah, in all these places, elites wanted state subsidies and supports, but they didn't want to be ordered around in a way that a proper developmental state would. Kind of the stick part of the carrot and sticks they didn't want to deal with. So I'm going to ask a few questions from the chat. There's one question that is, what sort of structures and approaches were taken to combat the fragmentation and casualization of workers and that you mentioned? So in other words, I guess the question is getting at there's a situation with a vast informal economy, with the shattering of traditional workplace, traditional working class. What measures were actually taken by the Pintide government to give them a firmer base to reverse some of these trends? And I guess the answer is not really that much. If like it seemed like a lot of this was just programs like direct cash transfers and funding of health and education and things like that that came from the commodity boom windfall, which are all good things, but nothing deeper than that. Besides for some plans that obviously Chavez was always announcing, big new plans to diversify the economy and opening up factories and whatever else. But that didn't seem to really amount to much in practice. But what do you think on this question?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Not much at all. And this is the big irony, right, of that comes out of the comparison. In the early, I'll be very brief on the earlier. In the earlier, it's elites themselves that kind of unwittingly, or at least, this wasn't their intention, right? Create an economy that empowers the working class, right? So if you look at the pink tide, right, these new kind of leftist or reform leftist politicians in power, they never attempt something comparable to that. Instead, what they do, right, is to, first of all, try to address the needs and the interest of their constituents by redistributing a lot of these commodity windfalls, right? This bonanza that's coming in, on the one hand, right? And it also tries to bolster, in some respects, or at least kind of defend the organization of these popular backers of their regimes, if anything, because they want an organized base to protect them, right? So they give them relief, welfare relief. They support their organizations, but what they don't do in any real significant way is to say, hey, beyond this, we're actually going to, the way ISI business elites did in the past, we're going to restructure the economy, right? So that we can move from a situation where our supporters are fragmented, right? Are languishing in the informal sector, making it very difficult for them to organize and to exercise any kind of leverage when they're making demands. They really don't do much of that at all. There are these symbolic gestures that, Chavez was always making these grand, right, majestic announcements that they're going to rebuild industrial complexes, aluminum, what have you. But it really led to nothing. In Bolivia, something very similar happened. Rather than moving from an economy that's expanding because, let's say, of the windfall that's coming in through the export of natural gas or soy, right, in the southeastern, produced in the southeastern parts of the country, right, taking that and reinvesting that, right, into a diversified industrial economy, that never really happens. And because they're just set on redistributing what is available to them and keeping their constituents as happy as possible.
But also there's a lot of challenges that would come about if they were trying to do that. Like it's not just getting together a sum of money to invest in new industries. There's problems of human capital and all sorts of other reasons why the most efficient thing to do, at least in a poor country like Bolivia, is just to get people out of extreme
Absolutely. And again, this is one of the big lessons, that restructuring the economy in that way, right, implied a massive effort and real confrontations, right, with these new neoliberal economic elites, because it would have meant diverting resources from them into new branches of the economy, new sectors of the economy. And the point I was trying to make is that absent an organized social force with the leverage to push in that direction, they decided it wasn't worth it. It was too difficult. They would keep trying to satisfy the needs of their backers, but they couldn't take on that fight. I'd say the only country that came somewhat close to doing this was Argentina under the Kirchsters, but not because, it took on a very ambitious economic restructuring project. Just because one way out of the crisis that the implosion of the early 2000s was to, devalue the exchange rate, right? And it made industrial imports much more expensive. And so that provided some protection for industry. But it was really paltry compared to the efforts at industrialization that had taken place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
So let's talk about the role of imperialism. So obviously, U.S. imperialism has been a great tool and weapon of domestic elites in Latin America. Either obviously we can name offhand all the left wing governments from Arbenz to Allende and so on overthrown both by domestic elites um, and support from U.S. Imperialism. To what extent do you think destabilizing just tacit approval for coups like the one in Honduras, and then obviously immediately recognizing the coup governments and so on, support for protest movements have undermined the pink tide? So, how much should we weight this question of imperialism?
Mm. That's a very good question. Um, it's tough. There's a lot going on. Of, Let me just start off by giving my answer. Okay, I think the kind of pressures, the intimidation, right, that came from abroad in the form of imperialism coming out of Washington, for instance, against these countries, was not nearly as important as what was going on domestically, and the kind of domestic class conflict and differences. That's not to say, of course, that the U.S. just stood by, right, neutrally, right. But I think we often exaggerate the impact of imperialism, right, in shaping these outcomes. And often, I think it's done really in very unhelpful ways. Often we point to the influence of imperialism to give a pass, right, to the domestic political class, right, the political class of these countries. That, well, they want to do more, but they can't because the power of imperialism or the power of multinational capital based in Europe and the U.S. is too strong, and they would if they could, right? But imperialism prevents it, doesn't allow them to push any further. I don't think that's the case. In fact, I don't even think that's the case. That I think let me put it this way: I think we exaggerate the role of imperialism in bringing down the classical left of the earlier period, right? The best example of this, I think, is the Allende government. This is where labor, the working class, actually did reach power with its own parties and its own political formations, organizations, right, in 1970. We all know that the Allende government only lasted 3 years and was toppled by a military coup in September of 1973. You hear quite often, right, that U.S. imperialism played a decisive role in Allende's toppling. And of course, U.S. intervention did play a role, but I don't think it played the decisive role. I think that the coup in Chile would have occurred with or without U.S. meddling. And the main reason for that was because of business and the right wing in Chile, right, getting organized and executing the coup with or without direction and or support from Washington. So if that was even the case then, right, and again, this is not to say that U.S. meddling didn't occur. It's not to say that Washington wasn't trying to shape events, didn't prefer certain governments, right, to fall. Right? Of course it did. But I think the way to think of it is that outside influence, right, is largely mediated by what's happening domestically. And in terms of the pink tide, what was happening domestically, right, didn't require US meddling, right, to shackle these governments and ultimately bring them down, right? The one case I think where US intervention had more of an influence was in Venezuela. And that's because from fairly early on, Washington and the foreign policy establishment understood that it could not play ball with Chavez or vice versa. Chavez would not play ball with Washington, and it did everything possible, right, to support domestic forces, and it did anti-Chavista domestic forces, and of course you see that all the way up to what happened just over a couple of years ago in the attempt to bring down the Maduro government by backing, this clown that got plucked out of nowhere, this Guaido guy. But even then, I think domestic dynamics, more than outside meddling, are much more determinant of the failures of the pink tide.
The Pete Buttigieg of Venezuela, just someone they just tried to turn into a media event. So I want to end with one last question that I think is much more in the vein of what your next article for Catalyst will be in a few months, maybe not 4, maybe 3 months. And by the way, everyone should subscribe to Catalyst as well as press a like on this video, subscribe to this to the channel as well.
You said 5 months, right?
Yeah. So here's a question. Do you foresee complete collapses of these pink tide leftist parties, or do you think they will continue to be a powerful force in politics for a while? So obviously, we've seen the decline of the pink tide from its peak. We've seen the toppling of the government in Bolivia through kind of this the coup in Bolivia. But it seems like there is a stable base. Like the pink tide won't be washed away. But what's your prognosis for the future?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's precisely what I'm writing about right now. The first thing to say is that I think beginning around 2017, 2018, the region began experiencing, right, the second major crisis of the neoliberal order. The first major crisis of the neoliberal order, right, was most pronounced precisely in the pink tide countries, right? That kind of very, very serious, how should I put it? That kind of those earthquakes, right? Political earthquakes that these countries experienced around the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, led to the pink tide. In the current case, right, the second deep and major crisis of neoliberalism in Latin America, I think, is more sharply impacting and shaping developments in non-pink tide countries. I think, for instance, the rise of López Obrador in Mexico is a reflection of this. The rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil as well. And then, of course, the major social explosion that Chile experienced in October and November is also, I think, an expression of the second big crisis of the neoliberal order. Now, in those countries, the popular revolt, be it on the streets as in Chile or through the ballot box as in Mexico and in Brazil, right, was directed at, right, kind of center-left reform parties and governments, right, that did not come to power through this kind of cycle of popular movements and mobilization, as in the pink tide. Those centrists or center-leftists, like in Brazil and in Chile, Mexico is a bit more complicated, but in Chile and Brazil, for instance, right, though the center-left, the PT in Brazil, the socialists in Chile, right, they came to power after the initial redemocratization process, right? And they themselves were the parties that managed neoliberalism in those countries, right? So the revolts, the insurgencies are against them. And I think it's very hard to predict, right, what the outcomes will be in these countries. The pink tide, on the other hand, or pink tide countries, on the other hand, I think, right, will, someone will look at Bolivia and say, you got to be crazy, right? But I think the way they get through this second big crisis will be a little more stable, actually. Ironically, I think that pink tide, the changes, the reforms of the pink tide, right? Many of them are going to be very hard to reverse. The actual kind of social policies, right? They will be whittled down somewhat. They will be kind of chipped away at, but it's going to be very hard to do away with them altogether. Meaning that even if pink tide governments, even lose power as they have, right? There will be an enduring legacy of some of their policies, which the right and power will have a very hard time, I think, completely, kind of eradicating. Now, in circumstances where the pink tide is toppled, right, through an outright coup, right, or the opposition turns to coups to get rid of the pink tide, as they've been trying to do in Venezuela, right? I think, and more recently in Bolivia, things will be much more in the air. There will be more uncertainty. But overall, I think the pink tide, the parties that they brought to power, and many of the new institutions they created and the policies they created, I think will remain core features of the politics in these countries, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I mean, you can't build institutions of mass struggle, even flawed ones, for 10, 15 years and then have people forget about it overnight. But obviously, if your organs that you're creating are organs of clientelism, of just distributing resources from the top to the bottom, once you no longer have resources, then they're going to be more brittle. Whereas in other cases, when they built stronger and more participatory organs of mass struggle, they're probably more likely to last. But in any case, Renee, I really appreciate you taking all the time. To everyone else, we're going to have we have stay-at-home lectures every single day this week at 6 p.m. Eastern. So please tune in. Tomorrow, we're getting to the question of, is Marxism Eurocentrism, and some other issues about why this label has been attached to a ideology of universalism and a materialist worldview, and also some of these wider questions about shifts within the academia in the 80s and 90s that we're just now emerging out of, thanks to the work of young left-wing materialist scholars like René Rojas and others. Not so young, actually, but a good scholar nonetheless. But thank you, René.
Thank you.